My name is Chris St. Martin, and I'm making this video because I'm out of options. I don't like the idea of my business being out there for the whole world, but I'm out of options and I really need help. So I'm hoping someone will understand my situation and help me because I've done everything I can think of, myself. My family's out of options and they've been trying to help, and at this point, we're pretty sure we're just getting screwed. But kind of hard to do that, prove that myself. So, just that we have an understanding of what's going on, I have to start 4 years ago because it's all connected, even though it's not supposed to be. Yay! So, back in 2013, I was pregnant with my oldest daughter. My mom dropped me off at a homeless shelter because I refused to give her up. I went from shelter to shelter and met someone who was going to become my second oldest dad. His name was Mr. Zimmer. He approached me, and after hearing how he was trying to get his life together after his divorce, his son's behavioral issues, him being sick, and how difficult it was for him to work while taking care of all of this, I empathized and stupidly offered to take care of his son while he was at work. After a while, I noticed the boy had more issues than I can actually help him with. On top of that, Mr. Zimmer was starting to cross professional boundaries, which was starting to make me uncomfortable. So I told him I couldn't do this anymore. It was putting too much stress on me, and I was already a high risk pregnancy. So after a few weeks, I got a letter from the boy. It made me feel bad. The boy begged me to come back, saying he'd behave and he was sorry. And I said okay, and I was supposed to take him to school the next morning. But unfortunately, I wasn't feeling good the night before and couldn't get any sleep, so I canceled and told him I wasn't able to. Well, later that day, I got a call from CPS. Now, this is in California, mind you, asking about a bruise that was apparently on the boy's ear. And I tried to explain that I hadn't seen the boy for about 2, 3 weeks. But the kid was still like insisting that I put the bruise on his ear. Apparently, I tried to twist his ear off. I don't know. I'd never been on the receiving end of CPS. My mom had gotten like dozens of calls and nothing ever came of it, ironically. Anyway, I never dealt with them before, and Mr. Zimmer convinced me that because now I was on their radar, they were going to take Rosie away. And the only way to make sure that wasn't going to happen was to basically get her out of their jurisdiction. So I let him convince me to go down to Mexico. He claimed I was going to work for his sister, who apparently lived down there. And yes, I know how stupid this sounds, but believe it or not, in San Diego, it's actually not uncommon for people to work in San Diego and live in Tijuana, just because for about $500 you can get an apartment on the beach. Yeah. So anyway, he said I was going to work for his sister, taking care of her kids, cleaning her house, and I was kind of already used to that kind of work before. I've done it a lot of times. It was actually my first and second job. So I said, okay. Well, when I got down there, that was not the case. The family that I was supposed to work for were honestly a bunch of alcoholics and drug addicts. The kids were dirty. And honestly, I don't know how this house was still standing. I was kept in the shed and I wasn't allowed to leave. And basically, they kept me there until I went into labor. And instead of taking me to the States to give birth, they took me to a Mexican hospital where no one spoke English. And I couldn't ask for anybody for any help. And even though technically my daughter would have dual citizenship because she was born down there, but I'm an American citizen, they don't just let you walk across the border with a baby with a Mexican birth certificate. It's a whole process. You got to go to the consulate, and it's a giant headache. And after I gave birth, Mr. Zimmer got even worse. He started, he was doing things that I didn't agree to. Whenever I fought back or refused, he would start hitting. The drunker he got, the worse he got. Because I couldn't cross with my daughter, I was basically stuck in Mexico unless he came with me. And even then, I had to pretty much just stay right by his side. So it's not like I could have asked anybody for help. On top of that, I didn't know who to ask for help. It became clear that I wasn't going to get help from my family. Didn't know of any other programs that could help. So I pretty much stayed down there. Um, Anytime he had money left over that he didn't drink, I would try to take it and squirrel it away, hoping to get her papers. Well, the first time I tried to leave, he came back early, saw it, we fought. He left for a little bit. I thought everything was okay. And then he comes back with Mexican police. And I was thrown in jail. No idea why. And I know that sounds like a huge load of BS, but honestly, in Mexico, you hear about all these things and you think, no, it can't be that bad. It is. You can literally hand a cop a 20, point to a random person, and they will be arrested. I know because it's happened to me, and it happened to my brother when he tried to help me. Well, that happened. So a couple hours later, I was released, made my way back to the house. And when I got there, my daughter wasn't there. Apparently, after the police, DEEF, the Mexican version of CPS, came, and Mr. Zimmer gave them my daughter. The house was torn up. I had developed an animal hoarding problem as a means to cope, but I still kept the house clean. And when I got there, there was animal poop everywhere. Everything was strewn around. It was nasty. And Mr. Zimmer was sitting there letting me know that, Deef had my daughter, and if he wanted my help to get her back, which was the only way I was going to get her back, I needed to do as he said. So, paid them all the money that I had. Eventually, I got her back. And after that, I stopped trying to leave. It wasn't worth it. So, a little while goes on. Because of that incident, Mr. Zimmer wasn't leaving to go to work as much. So we had to get a roommate. It was one of his friends. Well, eventually, Mr. Zimmer showed his true colors, and he and his friend would get into these arguments. Well, one was especially bad, where Mr. Zimmer would constantly disappear for a while, come back, kind of as a good way of showing who was in charge, because it was obvious that I wasn't going to make it without him. Well, after about 2-3 weeks, started running out of food, out of diapers, so it became clear I was going to have to go find him and convince him to come back. So I asked the roommate if he'd watch my daughter while I go and get Mr. Zimmer and bring him back. Had a few places that I knew he would be at. So went and found him. Took me all day to convince him. By the time we got back to the house, everything was cleared out of there. I had learned to keep the dogs outside, but this time even the dogs were outside. Or they were inside this time. And the house was once again a mess, and everything that was of value was taken. And apparently, according to a neighbor that we talked to who was there, she said that Deef came at the behest of the roommate, and the roommate claimed I abandoned my daughter and just left her on the couch, surrounded by the dogs, which was not the case at all. And so then it became them wanting more money, them wanting us to jump through this hoop and that hoop, and so tried doing all of that. Nothing was ever enough. They wanted more and more money, which I didn't have. So eventually, Mr. Zimmer and I went back to the shelter we were staying at, and I was only allowed to be around him or people he approved. One of those people was Mr. Ball, and we became close, we became friends. Eventually, Mr. Zimmer convinced Mr. Ball to help us move back down to Mexico and get us a place, because Mr. Zimmer was one of those people that if he could, basically, if he can lead you dry, you're his best friend. But once you have nothing else to give, you're his worst enemy. Or if you ever, go against what he says. So anyway, we make it back down to Mexico. We were still coming up to the States to try to get money. I wasn't allowed to get a real job. He made me panhandle with him. So that's how he was making his money. And yeah, I found out I was pregnant. This time I was allowed to give birth in the States. And even though now I know I should have reached out for help. I didn't at that point. I didn't think anybody could help me because anytime I did ask for help, I wasn't getting it. So I just stopped asking. So anyway, we took, at that time, the new daughter. Now I want to be clear, I was not in a relationship, Mr. Zimmer. I was basically beaten and raped for the better part of a year. And it just kept getting worse. Because he started drinking more. Granted, that's not the reason he was bad. He was just a bad dude. Drinking just made him more of an ass. So, Mr. Ball and I got closer. He started noticing how Mr. Zimmer was acting, and eventually it was because of him I was able to leave. One of the times that Mr. Zimmer left, Mr. Ball got me to pack up all the stuff, and we went to a motel in the States and tried to put our heads together of what we were going to do. Because I wasn't going to go back to Mexico, but my daughter was still down there. So we had to figure out something. Well, Mr. Zimmer started harassing me on the phone, started stalking, kept making these weird claims that Mr. Ball was a registered sex offender. Now, he pulled that crap with his ex-wife when she got a boyfriend. So I thought it was just same old BS, and just to be safe, I did check the database in California, didn't see anything. Well, Mr. Ball didn't tell me that he was originally from Nevada, and there he was registered. So eventually I called PD to report Mr. Zimmer, and Mr. Ball was the one that was arrested for non-compliance. And I'm not going to lie, it took a little bit to understand because, you know, Mr. Ball was my best friend. He got my daughter and I out of there. Never showed any inappropriateness, you know, those things that you notice people do that just makes you get all wiggy, and never saw that. If anything, Mr. Zimmer was the one that gave off the wigs. And honestly, in California, unless you're 21, you can't rent a hotel room. I don't know why, but the age down there is 21. And unfortunately, I was at 19, 20 at the time. Shouldn't make a big deal of difference, but it did. And in California, we don't have emergency shelters. There's not a DV shelter that you can get into at a drop of a hat. Every shelter, you either have to be there by a certain time, which when you're trying to get from Tijuana to on foot back to Mexico, even, you know, and using public transportation, you're not going to get there in time because they start like at between 5 and 7 p.m. And every other shelter besides that, you basically have to interview for to find out if you qualify. So there's not an actual DV shelter that you can go if you need a place to go at a drop of a hat. There should be, but there isn't. So honestly, I kind of clung to Mr. Ball because I had no options and I had no idea what to do. You know, and on top of that, again, best friend saved me because honestly, the way Mr. Zimmer was going, I wasn't going to be here much longer. Anyway, so he was arrested. He sent me his file, and at the time, you know, one, because again, best friend. Two, I saw a lot of holes in the file that he sent me from the lawyer in Nevada that I convinced myself of his innocence. So anyway, CPS got involved because Mr. Zimmer made claims that were proven false, but there was still the fact that I had a registered sex offender around my daughter. And, you know, obviously I posed a risk. Well, I learned my lesson. I mean, it took a little bit because I was still adamant that, you know, it couldn't be true. You know, the real danger is Mr. Zimmer, not Mr. Ball. Eventually, I wisened up and realized that I was taking an unnecessary risk with my daughter. I will say this, I'm grateful to getting involved with CPS in California because they were the ones that actually got my oldest back from Mexico. So that was the one good thing about it. Anyway, I did the parenting classes, I did the psych eval, I got on meds for mental health issues, stable housing. I started to learn to stay in one place. Um, I did the parenting classes. I did several groups to try to help be a better parent. I got rid of my animals, which I think helped once I got on medication. Um, and eventually I got my daughters back, and we moved up here to Montana to get a better life, and I had everything planned out. I had a house, lined up. I had a job lined up. I was keeping things clean. I was proving that I learned my lesson, and I thought I did. I really did. Anyway, we move up here. The house that we were going to rent got rented out from under us, so pretty much I ended up blowing all my money on a weekly motel trying to find a place to rent, which was not easy. I still had the job, which was good. However, during the move, I lost my meds, and all it took was my daughter to ask if we could have a cat, and we ended up, now keep in mind, we already had 2 dogs. So along the way, we ended up with 6 cats and a ferret. Say me being off my meds is not exactly good, because then my house becomes the Animal Kingdom show. And honestly, I make jokes just to try to cope with this. Believe it or not, I'm actually freaking out inside. Anyway, so I got my daughters back. We were for the first place we were in had mice, roaches, and bed bugs, and they kicked us out. They say they kicked us out because, the room was a mess, which it wasn't. I find it funny that they kicked us out about 2 days after I threatened to call the health department. So we moved into another place. During the time we were in Billings, I met a guy, and just to make sure I didn't end up in the same issue that I did with 2 previous guys, I ran a background check on him. Facebook stalked him and contacted 2 ex-girlfriends that had children to make sure that he, 1, wasn't abusive, 2, didn't have any drug issues, and 3, was safe to be around kids. They all agreed that he was emotionally stunted, but, had no problems around kids, no issues. So that was good enough for me. Plus, I also messaged his family to make sure that there was nothing that I should know that no one else knew. So, I thought, okay, this works. Anyway, fast forward, we move to a new weekly motel, and we all got sick with the flu. Not to mention, this place was a lot smaller than the other place. So not only were we cramped, but no one was taking care of the animals. So the place reeked. One, I shouldn't have had that many animals. And 2, even if sick, I should have made sure the place was clean, because that honestly could have gotten all of us even sicker, especially my kids. Anyway, CPS came to the door. They were called by the daycare that my daughters were going to. Something about a bruise. They text. Now, we dropped the kids off, I want to say about 8:30. I didn't get a text until about 12:30, 1 o'clock, asking about a bruise on my middle child. And I didn't notice the bruise, so I thought maybe it's something small. Maybe my 2 eldest went at it, and because those 2 would go at it like cats and dogs, so it wasn't unusual. They didn't send me a picture, so I had no idea what the reference was to. And so, that was it. I thought, well, no, CPS shows up my door, so they see the condition of the home, which is just awful. They show me a picture of the bruise, and it was behind the ear, in the ear, and ended right around here. It looked like someone just walloped my child. And I could never ask her about it, so I had no idea. They thought it was my now ex-husband, that he was the cause of it. And because I work nights. Well, that my husband would never do that. He's more the type to throw a temper tantrum and disappear for hours than, be violent. Anyway, at first I told him I didn't know what happened, because again, when I get frazzled, my brain kind of just shuts down. I'm barely able to keep 2 thoughts at a time. I wanted to know what Aurora said because I didn't know what to do. I mean, this is a guy with a clean background. I asked CPS what they wanted me to do. First, I asked them if they want me to break up with them and kick them out. They said, no, if we're going to be a family, then we need to do this together. Okay. So we did. They asked Aurora what happened, my second oldest, the one that had the bruise. And all she said was Shadow Monster did it, which doesn't help because Shadow Monster is basically the house scapegoat. You know, who got into the cookies, who drank your sister's sippy cup, um, who made the mess, you know, things like that. So we don't know anything about it. We still don't know what happened with the bruise. We talked to officers one time, never had any follow up, and CPS just was adamant. Every time we tried to talk about the daycare, they either would say, they would either go quiet or they'd say, we've already been over this, we're not going through it again, which makes no sense to me because, granted, I forget things very easily. But we never, as far as I know, the daycare was never investigated. And now, whenever I ask someone who's from here about the daycare, they get this look like they'd smelled something horrible, like, ew, you know, it's like, what? Because the online reviews were great, but I haven't met one actual person that has anything nice to say about the daycare. So, um, but they wouldn't listen. During this time, found out I was pregnant with my second youngest now. Um, all throughout the time, they told me that they wanted my husband and I to stay together, that we should do this together, that they had no concern to remove the little one. And they said that up until about a month before the due date, when all of a sudden they wanted my husband to move out, which he did. He went and lived with my brother. And then all of a sudden they were going to remove the baby at birth with no indication why. Even though we both did parenting classes, we did a CDE eval, we did the drug patch, I did a mental health eval and a psych eval. Now the mental health eval is supposed to be in lieu of the psych eval, but my lawyer said because it didn't say what they wanted it to say, they went back on what they originally said and wanted me to do the psych eval, which matched the mental health eval. Honestly, I just need to stay on my medication and continue with therapy, which I have been doing. It still wasn't enough. By that time, we got a better housing. We actually got an apartment. Kept it clean. No more animals. We had 3 cats at the time, and one of them was with the roommates. We got a roommate, a female that I was working with. Anyway, we did everything they asked. They removed my second youngest. And then I got her back about a month or 2 later. And under the condition that my husband wasn't around, and, that was it. And my dumb butt lost her 24 hours later. Now, Billings is a very small city. So you can get from one end of town to the other in about 30 minutes. And we only have one mall in the entire town. So here's why that's relevant. We were on the way back from a pediatrician's appointment. I was feeling restless. Our apartment was right near where my husband worked. So, and since he had to work from there all the way downtown, possible rest stops to get something to drink or something to eat would be Walmart. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to go to the Walmart. I'm going to go to the mall. Plus, I have some Christmas shopping to do anyway. And, I didn't have a stroller, so I carried the car seat around the mall. Ate something there. Started to feel sick. And that was when I ran into my husband, who apparently had the same thought I did. Anyway, I had to throw up. I couldn't get her into the car seat. Now, the bathroom at the mall is at the end of a narrow hallway with 2 sharp turns. And my worry was if she fell out of the car seat and bonked her head, that was it. Game over. So I noticed that there was a security officer and an off-duty social worker right there. I'm like, okay, if I leave her, in this type of environment with him, it'll be fine. I can go throw up and we'll go our separate ways, which is what I did, you know. And then after that, I called my social worker because I didn't want them to think I was hiding anything. Anyway, so lost my train of thought. Anyway, I picked up my daughter. We went our separate ways, called the social worker. She called me back later that night because I guess she heard it from the off-duty social worker that, you know, my husband and I were at the mall, and I tried to explain to her. And now, granted, I understand that this is all very suspicious because what are the odds? You know, and I said, look, you know, yes, what are the odds that my husband and I would be at the mall at the exact same time? But what are also the odds that me, my husband, and an off-duty social worker would be at the mall at the exact same time? You know, there's one mall in the whole state and it's near Christmas time. Pretty much everyone's going to be there. You know, she came, saw the apartment, saw that there was no evidence of my husband. There was, you know, he wasn't there. None of the stuff was there. It was obvious that he wasn't there, but they still removed her. So I worked hard. We got a bigger place because I was told that we needed to get a bigger place. At that time, he was working 2 jobs. I was working double shifts at my one job. And after a while, the stress just broke us apart. I started to notice that he was changing, and all we did was fight, and I knew it just wasn't going to be good, so we split. He went to Florida. I stayed up here to try to get the girls back. And I was close. I was doing in-home visits and all that stuff. Because my husband left, he left a lot of half-finished projects that I didn't know how to do. So I hired the handyman that worked at the motel I was working at. Now, Motel 6, 9 times out of 10, is a dump, but they do take their background checks seriously. I had to justify a ticket I got when I was 18. I started working there when I was like 24, 25. Yeah. So, my boss, even though he said he wasn't allowed to, the handyman also agreed to let me see the background check that we had to do when we apply. It was clean, no issues. I asked my social worker and at the same time the visit coordinator who was going to be, you know, monitoring the visits in home, if it was fine, because the only time I'm home is to do my visits or to sleep. Other than that, I'm working or doing appointments. And they said that was fine. Thought no issues. Okay. The visit coordinator, without saying anything to me, mind you, told my social worker she did not feel safe doing the visits at my house because I let some random guy walk into my home. The random guy was the handyman that I had continuously told her that, hey, he's on his way. Hey, he's outside. I'm going to tell him to just come on in so I can keep playing with the girls. And she didn't say anything to me. And even after the visit, didn't pull me aside, didn't ask anything, didn't look afraid. So I thought everything was fine. Well, apparently they Googled him, which I did not think of to do. I kind of just went off the background check, and I wish I hadn't. I should have checked more thoroughly. Found out years ago that he was not convicted. He was charged but not convicted of manslaughter years ago. So after that, they pulled everything back. It was back to supervised 2-hour visits. I wasn't allowed to drive my girls anywhere anymore. Even when we went to court, because I thought that wasn't fair, the judge said that, okay, and keep in mind, I wasn't dating him. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't even going to be considered, you know, childcare. It was honestly someone I was paying $100 a week to make sure the house, you know, stays up, because our landlord's a slumlord, doesn't fix anything. So anyway, even the judge said that the handyman incident was not reason enough to pull everything back as far back as it did. But CPS did it anyway, and even after I asked the judge, you know, if she could just put me back at where I was. I'm not trying to get a free ride, you know, get my kids back. I'm just trying to stay on the course I was at. That's all I was asking. And all the judge said was, well, thank you for your response. No actual answer, nothing. So I had to choose between guardianship and termination. I did the guardianship and focused on getting my younger one back. Well, after I signed the guardianship, I kind of fell off the wagon. At the time, I was about 8 years clean and sober. And yeah, I got blackout drunk and hooked up with someone because a few months later, I found out I was pregnant. And I talked to my lawyer, and he said, if anybody asks, tell the truth. But if no one asks, you don't have to disclose that. So no one asked. I didn't tell. Kind of the benefits of being fat. Anyway, gave birth, uh, and she was, except for being jaundiced, she was very healthy. No one knew about it. So I had her in my care for about 4 days. I took her to the hospital constantly because anytime I thought she was getting worse with the jaundice, I brought her in. So we went to her third follow-up appointment, and I ran into my now second youngest foster mom coming out of the pediatrician's office. Yeah. So I'm guessing she contacted my social worker because after the appointment, my social worker calls me and tells me to pull over. And she wants to take the baby. She didn't check my house. She hadn't been in my home for well over a year. I told her that she did not have the right because she said that she got a call about suspected neglect. Containing no one knew about the baby. I knew that was false. So, I told her, okay, come check the house, do an investigation. She refused. I tried to call my lawyer. Of course, he wasn't answering. And this is the second lawyer. I've had 3. The first one was good, but he got transferred to criminal. My second one, honestly, was more concerned with following CPS's rule instead of actually negotiating. And the third one, honestly, is just, he doesn't even return my phone calls anymore and is just not aggressive. Anyway, so I'm trying to get a hold of it anyway. I'm showing where it says that she cannot remove without clear, immediate danger. And having your other children removed is not enough. But she didn't listen. It got to the point where PD had to be called and order me to give her the baby, which I did. She still hadn't come and seen the house. Didn't do any type of investigation. After she took the baby, I called the pediatrician, asked if she saw any sign of neglect. She said no. I asked her if she'd be willing to write a letter. Apparently she wasn't allowed to, but she did urge me to get a copy of the medical records before CPS found a doctor that would claim there was neglect. So I did that. I got 2 character letters, one from a family friend and another one from my therapist. My brother and my roommate came with me to court, and when we got to court, the judge heard my side. She heard my brother. She didn't read the letters. She didn't look at the medical records. She listened to CPS and the visit coordinator and the CASA worker, all of them admitting they haven't been in my home for over a year, but were concerned based on the fact that my children were removed and previous CPS involvement. Despite the fact that I had complied and done everything they've asked. So the judge upheld the removal. I did an in-home safety parenting course. I continued with therapy. I didn't go off my meds. I was still employed. I kept the house clean. Occasionally it would slip, clutter here, just normal stuff, especially when you're working 2 jobs 7 days a week. But once, anyone said, hey, it kind of smells a little funky, or hey, you need to clean the stove, I got on it right away. And I kept in regimen. I was so obsessed with keeping my house clean, I developed a severe nervous disorder to where you could come out to my house and still see me carpet cleaning at 4 a.m. in the morning, even though even my brother, who lived with us at the time, was telling me, it's clean, stop. Anyway, did everything they asked, eventually got unsupervised, then in-home, then overnights. And earlier this September, we were going to do, I was going to have them 5 days a week. Yeah, 5 days for a couple weeks, and then I was going to have them back full time. And that same day that my daughter was dropped off, that all went away. My brother was approved to babysit, which he would do every Wednesday morning, normally so I could get some sleep, because I would work graveyard, and then get some sleep before my day job. Instead, I took the night off the night before so that way I could use that time to run errands that I needed to do. And because I have a seizure disorder and was just in a car accident a couple weeks prior, I wasn't allowed to drive, especially with my girls. So that meant I had to leave them while I went to go run errands. Now, when my second youngest was dropped off, she was tired. I put her down to bed, closed the baby gate. I asked my other roommate if he would feed and water the dogs while I, got everything set up. My youngest came, my brother came. They were all set up. I noticed my roommate close and lock the door, and I checked it just to make sure it was just a habit I got into, because I was always trying to prepare for everything. And we went on our way, and we ran our errands. A couple hours later, I get a call from my brother saying I had to get home because Abby, my second youngest, got into the backyard and the dogs attacked her. So I'm racing over there. I get another call about 5-10 minutes later from my brother about how police are at the door. So police officer was telling me I need to get there soon. I told him I'm doing my best. I keep getting the red light, so he said go ahead and just run them. So I did. I get there. There's a lot of police officers. There's an ambulance. The only thing the officer tells me is that my daughter was attacked by the dogs. So I pick her up. I tell my brother that I want the dogs gone, and I hop into the ambulance with her. And at the same time, I'm crack calling the social worker to let her know what happened, because I'm just trying to make sure I'm still in compliance. So my social worker is out of town, so I had to deal with her supervisor. Now, at this time, I found out that my daughter needed a lot of stitches. They found a fracture on the side of her head that might need surgery if it was leaking spinal fluid. She ended up having the surgery, and then they found out they didn't have to do the surgery because it wasn't leaking spinal fluid. I guess when they cleaned out the wounds, a pocket of fluid formed, and they thought it was spinal fluid. So they did the surgery and realized afterwards they didn't have to. She had to get a tube in her head temporarily because I guess the scalp got separated from the skull, and there was just so much blood. Anyway, talked to the supervisor, explained everything, and I told her everything I knew. I told her that she was asleep. She got past the baby gate. I didn't know she could unlock doors, but she unlocked the back door. My brother didn't know she was awake. Apparently he was making lunch for both of them and was going to wake Abby up afterwards. I explained how I went to court the day before to defend my dogs, that they weren't dangerous, because back in May there was an incident with a little dog. When my dogs got out, they wanted to play with little dog, and they'd never been around a little dog, and so they were rough with it. They all tried to pull on the dog, and yeah, it was a shit show. And I went to court for it and tried to explain that my dogs had never had an incident before or after that. They went through training. Even the trainer said that this was not a prelude to aggressive behavior. I had a vet that said that the dogs were very mild-mannered. My dogs went with me to work. We've never had another problem. On top of that, my daughters had played with the dogs since they were little. Now, I don't want you to think I'm justifying the dogs. I'm not. I'm just trying to paint a picture that no one saw this coming. Because the trainer told me that most big dogs, unless raised with little dogs, see little dogs as toys. So it's common for them to, hurt them when not meaning to. And I tried to explain that to the judge.